I was born on a one-night stand in Kansas, a little town called Pickaway. My mother, the show traveled on, and my mother stayed there for 2 weeks and then rejoined the show with me.
Obviously, you're people who were showbiz. What exactly did they do?
My dad was a comedian and all great eccentric dancer and tricks. He wasn't exactly an acrobat, but darn near. And my mother played musical instruments and danced with him. And of course, when I came into the act, then he got the idea of trying to show the audience how to bring up children correctly. And every time I did something he didn't like, he'd either take me with the back of the neck and throw me through a piece of scenery or kick me clean off the stage through chairs, tables, or anything that would be in the way. I grew up getting knocked around.
Yeah, there's a story that a society for the prevention of cruelty to children complained about your parents.
We ran into that trouble every place when I joined the act. And they took me into New York when I was around 5 years old. Number one is that at that time, the Gary Society law in New York, which hadn't been very important yet, it was more to buck child labor than anything else in factories. But the law there says that no child under the age of 7 can even walk on the stage. And then, well, we got around that because they lied about my age. They said I was 7 when I was just 5.
That's where you started to perform at the age of 5.
No, I had been getting a salary since I was 4 years old. And the next thing was that the law said that no child under the age of 16 can walk wire, juggle, do acrobatics, roller skate, play musical instruments, an awful list of things. But none of them said that you couldn't kick him in the face.
No.
And for that technicality, we were permitted to work, but we did get stopped often.
This was with the heyday of vaudeville, American vaudeville.
Your heyday of vaudeville started around the turn of the century, around 1900. B.F. Keith was the first man to glorify his theaters and made them as high class as any of the legit theaters we had in the country. The theater he built in Boston first cost him $1 million to build, and when you go back 60 years, $1 million was an awful lot of money.
A lot.
Then one in Philadelphia he built was almost as expensive. And he took vaudeville and raised it from the 10, 20, and 30 cent class up to the $1.50 class, and really added class to vaudeville. Well, I saw that.
Was it fun in those days?
Yes. Your high-class vaudeville theaters did the best business of any type of theaters in the country. And I knew all the great acts and a lot of great people. I've worked with, you can imagine, now that it sounds like ancient history. I've even worked with Lillian Russell.
Was she really beautiful?
Most gorgeous woman I ever saw in my life.
But you would also travel in vaudeville all over the United States.
That's
Canada,
right.
too.
That's right.
Now, that must have been a pretty hard way to make a living.
Well, no, the traveling part didn't bother us. We were used to hotels and trains and boats. And we had a summer home. We didn't work in the summer. Our summer home was in Muskegon, Michigan. There's a whole actors colony there. You get to spend 3 months a year there. And we used to look forward to so many towns, too. See, for instance, we had a German boarding house in New York that was a home to us because you'd be in New York more often than any place else. And even when we laid off a week or something like that, we'd generally get on a train, go to New York, spend that week.
Now, wasn't 1915 the year that you started your career in pictures?
No, 17.
How did that come about?
Well, we had trouble with the United Booking Office. My father did. And there was a strike coming up, an actor's strike, which didn't happen often, but this was one of the first attempts. And I sent them folks home, and I went to New York alone and went up to our representative and said, I want to work alone, put Pa and Ma in the home in Muskegon. He says, all right, took me over to the Schubert's office, and the Schubert signed me immediately to go into the passing show in 1917, the Winter Garden. And while I was leaving that office, walking down the street, I ran into an old vaudeville performer who was with Fatty Arbuckle of the Keystone Force. And Arbuckle's contract with Senate was up, and he had just signed with Joe Skank, an independent producer. At that time, he was making pictures with his wife, Norma Talmadge, and her sister, Constance Talmadge. And he signed Arbuckle. Arbuckle says, "Have you ever been in a motion picture?" And I says, "No, I've never even been in the studio." He'd seen me work on the stage. He says, "Well, come on down to our studio on the Norma Talmadge studio over on 48th Street, and do a bit with me and see how you like it." Says, "When are you shooting?" Says, "Tomorrow morning to start." Says, "All right, I'll be there." So I'm waiting for rehearsals to start in the Winter Garden. I get down, I did that picture, and I was fascinated by everything there was about motion pictures. The first thing I did was to get in the cutting room, see how they put scenes together, projecting room and tear a camera to pieces and everything else.
With you was a love at first sight with pictures.
Yes, and digging up material. I was a veteran. I didn't know it at the time, but I turned out to be Arbuckle's whole writing staff for gags.
Not only that, but your background on the stage prior to that had been visual comedy.
That's right, all visual.
Which adapted itself very well to pictures.
That's right.
Slapstick.
So I only, instead of doing the one bit in the picture, I stayed there and worked that whole week, went all the way through the picture, and went up to my representative and said, "I don't want to go in the Winter Garden, I want to stay in pictures."
What was your impression of Hollywood when you came out here for the first time to work?
It was marvelous. Well, we actually worked harder, but didn't mind it.
All hours of the day?
Oh, you never knew. We decide to work all night, and we never had schedules, not outfits like ours. Number one, I owned my own studio. I owned all the equipment. The studio owned it all. So if we said, "Let's set up the camera," it didn't cost us a cent because the cameraman's under salary for the year. The cameras we owned, we're not paying rental on anything. And when I finally got into feature-length pictures in 22, all they wanted from me was 2 pictures a year. And that wasn't taking life easy. We'd have been really pressed if we'd have tried to turn out a 3rd picture a year. 2 was ideal, give you a spring and a fall release.
Tell me, how did the business of the frozen face come about? The deadpan
That came
comedy?
from the stage. As I grew up, I was the type of comedian that the minute I laughed at what I did, the audience didn't. So I just automatically learned to take everything serious. And by the time I was, something like 10 or 11 years old, working with a sober face was mechanical with me. Never even thought about it. So when I went into pictures, I was 21, and I got the reputation immediately called Frozen Face, Blank Pan, and things like that. We went in the projecting room and ran our first 2 pictures to see if I'd smiled.
You made sure that you didn't?
Well, hadn't paid any attention to it. We found out I hadn't. Just a natural way of working.
Would you hope for anything more out of your career than what you've had?
No, I had a very interesting career. In other words, I have no complaints.